the Mashantucket Pequot Museum, where you can experience the sights and sounds of the tragedy of the Pequot War in a remarkable film that opens your eyes and takes your breath away at the same time.
East of the River is part of the Connecticut Experience series, co-produced by CPTV and the Connecticut Humanities Council. Together, we're exploring Connecticut's rich history and culture. Funding for the show comes from our title sponsor, the Mashantucket Pequot Museum. Additional support is provided by the Community Foundation of Southeastern Connecticut, with special thanks to Lucy Bartlett Crosby and the Chronicle Printing Company. East of the River is a co-production of CPTV, the Connecticut Humanities Council, and Simon Pure Productions.
Eastern Connecticut. A unique place, a part of the state, but a place apart. A distinctive region that has in many ways from the start defined what Connecticut truly means. It is a place of striking beauty, remarkable natural resources, and a resourceful people whose history speaks of grand accomplishment and great disappointment. Its story is one of successive cycles of economic boom and bust, of struggle and resilience, of reinvention and revival. Throughout its constantly transforming history, the region continues to be profoundly connected to its past, east of the river. Eastern Connecticut's distinctiveness is rooted in the land itself.
Connecticut was established as a river colony, beginning in Old Saybrook and working your way up the river into the broad region of the lowlands. So the state Connecticut derives from the lowland that sits in the middle of it, and the land to the east and the land to the west of that lowland are merely attached to it. East of the river is a very different place. That is, the physical geography is different, and you can identify that just by looking at the drainage. If you go to the west, all the rivers run down to the Connecticut and join it. If you go to the east, the rivers run away from the Connecticut. So the eastern part of the state has always been more alienated from the namesake river, the Connecticut River, than is the west. And the division in eastern Connecticut is really along the Bolton Range, which runs from the front at Enfield all the way down to the Salmon River region. To the west of that lies the Connecticut River lowland, and the stream drainages to the west are very, very short and segmented and small. But once you get over the Bolton Range, all the drainage gathers into a same portal at Norwich, Connecticut. And it comes down the Quinnebog, it comes down the Shetucket, comes down the Willimantic, comes down the Hop River. That whole area from essentially the Massachusetts border all the way over to the Rhode Island border drains down, entering in at Norwich. And everything north of that point is a very different region. When you get to the south, you tend to see shorter drainages, deeper estuaries, harder rocks, and a very shoreward-looking culture that is essentially maritime.
Human beings entered eastern Connecticut about 10,000 years ago. A gentle topography allowed for easy movement of people and animals over the landscape. The shoreline's rich marine estuaries attracted a native population to its bountiful fishing and hunting areas. These groups were larger and more settled than those in the north, who moved with the seasons. The European settlers, who started arriving in the region in the 1630s, found Indian tribal groups with complex alliances and shifting boundaries. In the eastern region, all paid tribute to the Pequot, the strongest, most populous tribe in the area. The Europeans, first the Dutch, then the English, established a lucrative trade in furs with the native population.
What made this region very distinctive is a resource that emerged during the fur trade that became the most important commodity during that time, and that was wampum. Wampum is a shell bead. The largest distribution of these shellfish appeared to be between the Connecticut River and Narragansett Bay. And in fact, the Dutch referred to this region as the mint of wampum production. And whoever controlled that wampum controlled the fur trade. For a short period of time, eastern Connecticut probably became the most important geographic locale in all of North America, because this is where all the wampum is coming from. And of course, we know from the later history that that competition between native groups and between the European powers eventually resulted in conflict between the English and the Pequots. and of course the Pequot War in 1637 and 38. Essentially what happened was the English attacked the Pequots and wanted to eliminate them as a political and economic factor in all of this. And in so doing, they set the stage for another 3 or 4 decades of political maneuvering in this region between the English and the Narragansetts and the Mohegans that really played a very important role in shaping colonial history and policy for the next 100 years. To understand the colonial history of Connecticut and the colonial history of New England, you need to understand what's going on in eastern Connecticut in the first half of the 17th century. I think it had a huge impact on the political landscape, if you will, of all of New England.
Soon after the Pequot War, European settlers began spreading up the Connecticut and Thames rivers and along the length of Long Island Sound in search of farmland. By the mid-1700s, colonists had pushed into northeastern Connecticut, founding numerous new towns. Earlier Connecticut towns were communal, settled by Puritans for religious reasons. These new northeastern towns were founded on different principles.
Most of northeastern Connecticut was settled on the basis of land speculation. Individual land speculators who were well connected in the General Assembly, or indeed who were members of the General Assembly, or possibly even governors and lieutenant governors, so that you had individualized settlement. You didn't have the communal spirit, you didn't have the communal organization that you had in these earlier settled places. So that from the start you had a very different kind of a attitude toward community in many, not all, but many of the places in especially northeastern Connecticut.
Eastern Connecticut's identity grew more distinctive in the early 18th century with the First Great Awakening, a widespread evangelical movement that was especially strong in eastern Connecticut.
The soil was thin and rocky, thinner and rockier even than Litchfield County. The farms were not producing enough for a good living. There was tight and severe times as a general rule all through the early 1700s, and this is one of the factors. It's this not impoverished, but not the rich kind of life that was being led in other parts of Connecticut, that led to anxieties that created the Great Awakening, that great religious movement of enthusiasm, of a heartfelt rather than intellectual approach to religion. And that, in turn, led to a breakdown in deference, where the old light so-called ministers were being castigated as being ungodly and false, worshipping false gods and one thing or another. And that breakdown in deference then fed into the opposition to the royal policies of the 1760s and 1770s, so that you had the most radical of the patriots coming from eastern Connecticut, and they were really the leading figures.
In 1765, the British government proposed that tax stamps be purchased by colonists for many government services. There was widespread opposition, with Connecticut resistance strongest in the East.
Eastern Connecticut was really a hotbed of revolutionary activity from the Stamp Act on. And one of the great changes in Connecticut politics is that Stamp Act election of 1765. You know, when the Easterners, the folks from eastern Connecticut, succeed in taking over the state, they elect a governor. The general court is largely composed of eastern men, or at least, you know, they now have influence, and they had an axe to grind. You know, they had felt for years that they had been second-class citizens, and they had been, I think, resentful for a long time of what they perceived as efforts by folks from the rest of the colony to discourage efforts to increase trade and commerce.
The center of Connecticut's revolutionary effort was in Lebanon.
Jonathan Trumbull was born here in 1710. He was a graduate of Harvard. He really did like the mercantile world, and he joined his father in business, and he expanded the business, and it grew quite sizable. He invested in ships. He even built ships over in East Haddam on the Connecticut River, and he became the largest meat packer in the colony of Connecticut by gathering cattle from all around the surrounding towns and shipping them primarily to the West Indies. At the time that the Revolution broke out, from 1775 to 1783, he opened up his store and used that as what came to be known the War Office for meetings of the Council of Safety and for the everyday routine that he had to be in command of as Commander-in-Chief of Connecticut's militia, Navy, our 13-ship Navy. And it was here in this town that Connecticut's contributions of men, material, and especially food and supplies for the Continental Army were gathered.
Farming has always been important to eastern Connecticut. Most eastern farm families in the 17th century produced little more than they consumed. In the 18th century, more farmers were able to create modestly successful businesses.
All the forests that we see are of relatively recent origin. At one point, really from the late 18th century right up through the 19th century, I would say well into the 20th century. Most of the land around here would have been farms. Most of it would have been open. Very few trees. You would have seen fields, hay fields. You would have seen sheep pastures, some land planted with corn. Few chickens, few cows. The farms typically were 60 to 150 acres in extent. They were small family farms, widely spread out. And that was really true right up until World War II.
Eastern Connecticut farms played a critical role in the development of the region's huge maritime trade to the West Indian islands of the Caribbean.
Farmers from Lebanon and from other communities up north of Norwich would send their goods to sea. If we look to the early 19th century, the most important products being sent to sea out of eastern Connecticut was livestock. After that came the produce of the farm. That could have been flour, it could have been cornmeal, and other products, lard and salt pork, salt beef. Those were large, important exports. After that came codfish, and that brings us right back down to the coast.
The maritime economy was sustained by agriculture. It was an immense quantity of material that was brought to the West Indies. Sailed out of Norwich primarily, also out of New London, all for the consumption of the animals and to some degree the people that worked down there.
After unloading at the large West Indies plantations, Connecticut vessels often sailed on to West Africa and brought back cargoes of slaves. Africans were a presence in eastern Connecticut from early in the life of the colony. Many African slaves labored in rural parts of eastern Connecticut, some on large plantation-style farms.
One of the things that surprises a number of people is the issue of slavery and Connecticut's connection to it. And southeastern Connecticut had the heaviest concentration of people of African ancestry during the colonial period, during the 1600s, 1700s. And you could find those individuals engaged in bond servant work in people's households, in the fields, working around the docks, and the documents from that time period clearly reveal the strong African presence there.
As the seaport towns developed, so did the inland towns to supply them with goods for shipment. Without the building of the wharves in New London and Norwich, you never would have had, development inland. Norwich had a very advantageous position because it could, by being inland, sort of cut off the trade goods coming in from the inland area, ship them out of Norwich instead of New London. So actually Norwich grew at the expense of New London during the 18th century, the 1700s, and in the 19th century, because of the manufacturing, it also outstripped New London.
The maritime trades have always been a significant part of eastern Connecticut's economy.
Starting here in Norwich and working your way south through Ledyard, Gales Ferry, Montville, New London, and then of course Groton, Mystic, and Stonington, and all the areas south of here were all very rich areas for maritime activity. Whaling, shipbuilding, fishing, and almost every other occupation you can think of connected to the maritime. It sustained the southeastern Connecticut area from the very beginning and continues today through obviously companies like General Dynamics, Electric Boat, still building submarines, shipbuilding.
Shipbuilding was a leading industry in eastern Connecticut during the 18th and 19th centuries.
The local waters were their embayments and protected harbors, and rivers and estuaries were ideal for locations for shipbuilding operations. And a nice connection there to think about is that in the hulls of these vessels, in the timbers themselves, Connecticut was going to sea, Eastern Connecticut was going to sea, not just southeastern Connecticut, but also the trees of the Quiet Corner were going to sea.
Fishing has been a continuous coastal and riverside activity. The Stonington fishing fleet dates at least to 1750. The fleet has been greatly diminished in recent years, buffeted by the changing fisheries, market forces, and increased governmental regulation. Just a few miles west of Stonington, New London found its first great maritime wealth in whaling.
New London was involved in whaling from the colonial era sporadically. It really took off and became a fully engaged whaling port, so to speak, beginning about 1819, and it remained so for the better part of the next century. New London, for a period of time, was the second largest whaling port in the world, only behind New Bedford. And of course that meant we needed to have hundreds and thousands of men to work on those ships. We'd find young men coming from the urban centers and from the hinterland coming into New London, signing on to whaling ships. We would also find men coming back from other parts of the world, join those New London whaling vessels as they crossed the Atlantic, and they would come back to New London. African Americans as well. We could look to 1850 and we find that 60% of the employed men of color in New London are mariners. Almost all of them, doubtless, are whalemen. So the community began to grow and change and become more diverse through this maritime contact.
Native Americans, for example, made up 1/3 of the crews of many of these vessels that went to the West Indies. And black Americans as well were quite prominent in that. In fact, there were some all-black crews that sailed in and out of New London.
So when it came to whaling, when it came to different types of shipping and trade, you could find a strong African presence. People of African ancestry who worked aboard ship found that there was a greater sense of equality aboard ship, even in some cases where people were enslaved, as a matter of fact, than you would find on land, because people had to depend on each other for survival.
Historically, the heyday when the maritime economy was at its height and at its richest would be the early and mid-19th century. And if you look around the southeastern Connecticut area, you'll see that the architecture of the region reflects that time period more than any other. Many of the other public edifices around the towns and the cities all reflect that.
It's pretty clear that southeastern Connecticut, being here on the shoulder of the sea, gives it a different character. It gave the people who lived here different sorts of lives and different concerns. It will always be a part of the identity of this community.
When the Industrial Revolution took hold in the 19th century, Eastern Connecticut quickly became a center of the emerging textile industry.
Eastern Connecticut was blessed with these rivers that were not so big that you couldn't possibly dam them and use them for water power, but not so small that all you could do is get a sawmill or a gristmill out of it. We have a lot of those middle-sized streams, like the Shetucket River, which could produce several hundred horsepower that could be adapted to use in textile production.
Eastern Connecticut's rivers and their broad banks soon attracted investment from just across the state border.
It comes out of Providence very early, first decade of the 19th century, with Samuel Slater and the Brown family developing small factories for the spinning of thread. They're small scale. I mean, they're employing 20, 30 people at first. They're only spinning, they're not weaving for another generation. Within 20 years, there are full-blown weaving mills that are larger in scale. There were literally scores and scores of mills throughout eastern Connecticut. 4/5 of the textile mills of Connecticut are located in eastern Connecticut.
By 1818, Connecticut boasted 67 cotton mills, led by Windham County. Throughout the region, thriving mill villages were established in farm communities. By 1820, Connecticut was second only to Rhode Island in the percentage of its population engaged in manufacturing. These mills eventually provided jobs for tens of thousands of workers during the 19th and early 20th centuries. The town of Putnam grew from a rural outpost to a large town with 5 textile mills supporting its economy.
From the very first, the mills was successful. One of the first railroads in the United States, the Norwich-Worcester Railroad. It arrived here in 1839, and from there on, the mills were secure to expand. So as a result, we now have 5 extant mills on this river within a mile of each other. And the last was built in 1872. I worked in 2 of the mills myself when I got out of high school in 1938. And this was our future. You'd work in the mill. We called it Belding University instead of Belding Mill. And we were going to marry, have 3 kids, stay in Putnam all our lives, and make it go over.
The development of the industry feeds on itself. You have the capital, you have the expertise, and you have the workforce. And it's all right there in close proximity. And it was good for several generations. Even though the rest of Connecticut had developed many industries, firearms, hats, brass industry, and so forth, in 1880, textiles was still the #1 manufacturing enterprise in Connecticut as a whole. And that was because it was so intensive here in eastern Connecticut. Each of these textile mills employed hundreds of workers. Some of them, such as the one in Willimantic, employed thousands of workers. And in an area that's as rural as this, that was an immense impact. Very little other industry took hold in this part of the state.
As eastern Connecticut's mills grew, area railroads expanded routes in order to profit from the growing trade in raw materials and finished goods. The prosperous 19th century Connecticut mill economy depended on purchasing ever more raw materials.
Most cotton mills in New England depended on southern cotton for their very life. The raw southern cotton is produced by slave labor, purchased and then shipped north, and then turned into thread, cloth, and other items that people wore every day in America.
The Ponema Mill in Taftville, completed in 1871, became the largest single cotton factory in the country. It was one of the last of the great New England mills to shut down in 1972. Like countless others, Prime Dugas emigrated with his family from Canada to Taftville. He later started a photography studio to supplement his mill income. His youngest son, Rene, took over the business in 1935.
My father started in 1882. The photographer in my father's day, of my day, he was the town historian. See? Anything that happened in town, he used to go over there and take a picture of it. And we used to take pictures of anything. To have a parade going on, we'd take pictures of it. All the streets were beautiful. I mean, right near every house had white picket fences. They had trees. They had an oak tree and an elm tree, alternating up and down every street. And living in Taftville, we knew everybody. Knew everybody. You could walk up and down every street and tell you who lived in every house. You were with neighbors, you see, and so it was a pleasant experience working in the mill. In fact, a lot of the kids in school were anxious to get to the 6th grade and go to work in the mill. I graduated from grammar school in 1923. There were 660 people in the school. 8 people graduated. So it gives you an idea of everybody wanted to go to work in the mill, and that's what they were brought up to do. Without the mill, there was nothing. Every bit of income that they had came from the mill. Yeah, all the businesses that grew came from the mill. On Tuesday night, that was payday. And everybody came in with an unopened pay envelope and gave it to the parents. And I handed my pay envelope until I got married at 27 years old.
In Willimantic, the American Thread Company drove a booming city economy that lasted until the 1930s.
They made incredible profits, massive profits. In fact, in 1864, the Willimantic Linen Company, which was the company in those mills, was the biggest company in Connecticut, produced the best cotton thread in the world. So this is why Willimantic is known as the Thread City. Where we sit now is a really good example, a representation of all the wealth and the prosperity and the intensity of the Industrial Revolution. You see in these magnificent monuments that money was no object to these people. So on one side you had the real ostentatious wealth, and then on the other side you had the little mill villages all around here with immigrants. There were 3,500 people working at the mill in 1917-18. By the 1920s they'd built 3 or 4 extra mills. The American Thread Company had purchased every thread mill in New England, closed them all down, same process that happens today, and made Willimantic the headquarters of American Thread.
While some former mill workers look back on the mills with nostalgia, mill work was often grim, with long hours, low wages, and dangerous conditions.
And they would work 60-hour weeks in the mills in shocking conditions where you couldn't breathe. They would die of brown lung from breathing in all the cotton dust, the noise, you couldn't see, the dirt. They would die of exhaustion and disease. In the late 1870s, there were terrible outbreaks of cholera. Hundreds were dying every summer with the hot weather because they had no running water.
For many immigrants, however, working in the mills was a huge improvement over their previous lives.
I worked in every department of the mill. Working in the mill in those days, was not what a lot of people say that it's like that it was a drudgery. It wasn't. In comparing with today's conditions, well, yes, but in those days we had no comparison. And my father lived in a log cabin, and there was 8 children in that log cabin. They came here, they had brand new houses. And they had 7 rooms. There was 12 children alive in my family, so we had to sleep 3 in the bed, and I slept 3 in the bed for years, and it wasn't a drudgery. It was a real improvement over their former lives.
The first to work in the mills in the early 1800s were the children of area Yankee farm families. Spurred by the potato famine of 1845, Irish immigrants poured into Connecticut, with many going to work in the mills. But perhaps the most dramatic immigration to eastern Connecticut was that of the French Canadians. To escape poverty, 1/3 of the population of Quebec moved to New England during the 19th century to find work in the mills. Many communities, like Plainfield and Grosvenordale, became primarily French Canadian.
These people came down in droves. Taffel became a French Canadian community. I mean, French Canadian in the true sense of the word. I mean, we had French homilies in church. If you wanted to do business in Taffel, which a few of the merchants from Norwich came up, and they had to talk French, you see. I knew the words to the Marseillaise before I even knew there was a Star-Spangled Banner.
Willimantic typified the immigration experience.
The Irish came in the 1850s and 60s. Following them came the French Canadians. In the 1900s, there were many Eastern Europeans, Polish, Ukrainians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Russians, Italians, Czechs. And after the 1950s and 60s, a lot of Puerto Ricans came. So each immigrant group that came, I think, did suffer some discrimination. They were impoverished. They were the new kid on the block. They lived in distinct neighborhoods in town and were discriminated against. Eventually, they would assimilate into American culture and all have jobs and houses and speak the language, and then another group would come.
In the 20th century, immigration patterns began to affect the Connecticut countryside, as many Yankee families sold their farmland to Slovak, Polish, and other immigrants from Eastern Europe. In the early 20th century, numerous Eastern European Jewish immigrants established farms in communities like Colchester, Lebanon, and Moodus.
So there is a real flip in the ethnic makeup of the farming part of eastern Connecticut that occurs in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. And that's why we have the ethnic diversity that we really have in these towns now.
In the last two-thirds of the 20th century, one mill after another closed or relocated to the south. Many mills were claimed by fire, either accidental or by way of arson. Persistent unemployment, declining population, and pockets of rural and urban poverty plagued many old mill towns in the region. In Putnam, as in many riverside mill towns, major floods in 1936, 38, and 55 hastened the steady decline.
In the 55 flood, they all went. It was a domino action from up in Massachusetts, and we lost all of them. And from there on, there isn't one textile company in Putnam now. We lost 1,000 people in Putnam after the 55 flood in our population. So a lot of people are working, like during World War II, they went to work at Electric Boat and Pratt & Whitney, 50 miles. If you were making any money in Putnam, you were going there. So there was a lot of low pay in this area for many years.
Once booming Willimantic suffered a typical fate.
The Depression hits in the 30s, and then the post-war boom passes northeastern Connecticut by because the interstate highway system doesn't come here. Willimantic suffered once the railroads disappeared in the 50s, and then the mills left in the 60s and eventually closed in the 80s. This decline just kept going and going and going.
Just as the Puerto Rican population was sort of settling into these jobs, that's when a lot of the mills began to close down, downsize, go south, and then go overseas. And so what that left is a pretty large unemployment problem.
Most mill villages lost population as the industry began its long decline. Today, the once dominant old mill villages still help shape the character of the region. Many communities have one or more mills at various stages of disrepair or reuse, often with adjacent neighborhoods of former worker housing.
Up until really 20 years ago, there wasn't a lot of building in this part of the state. So you had farmhouses on the rural roads, you had a few commercial centers like Willimantic and Danielson and Putnam, and then all there was left was mill villages. These villages had a tremendous sense of uniformity about them. So the majority of people 20 years ago still lived within these mill villages. They own the houses now, they had fixed them up, they weren't all identical anymore, but still you had these mill villages. We have the geography of the area still really kind of divided up into mill villages. I'm from Dayville, I'm from Attawagan, I'm from Baltic, I'm from Versailles, I'm from Hanover. People still think of these as the places, defining the places, even though no one works in a textile mill anymore.
As the mills faded away in eastern Connecticut, a new economic engine, the defense industry, emerged. East Hartford aerospace manufacturer Pratt & Whitney employed as many as 47,000 Connecticut workers during the Vietnam War years. Today, the state workforce stands at about 11,000. In the southeast, the Coast Guard Academy, the Naval Subbase, and Submaker Electric Boat constitute the heart of the region's defense community. EB greatly prospered during the major 20th century conflicts, becoming the region's largest employer and dominant industry, peaking at 25,000 employees in Connecticut. Employment levels plummeted with the end of the Cold War to about 9,000 today.
The defense industry, through employment and through the neighborhoods that it supported, really gave people a sense of place and belonging, whether it was Pratt or EB or any of the other smaller subcontractors over there, which were so important. The fact that that's not there as much has left some people sort of unmoored in a way, I think, maybe searching a little bit. They wonder what the future will be like for their kids. They know it'll be different than their lives were, or their parents' lives.
I almost always write about people with a sort of an Eastern Connecticut identity and also an Eastern Connecticut mentality. I think a lot of people who are raised in Eastern Connecticut end up staying here. That certainly is the case with me. I think we tend, as Eastern Connecticut people, to be independently minded, sort of set in our ways. I don't think we are particularly acquisitional. I think a lot of it has to do with who our grandparents were. For many of us here in eastern Connecticut, our grandparents came over in steerage. They were propelled, I believe, by equal measures of gumption and desperation.
One of the really nice things about this part of the state is you have a lot more ordinary people. People from working class backgrounds, even if they're not personally working class. I mean, you can talk to someone that's worked as a metallurgical engineer, and he still remembers, well, his father, his grandfather, they worked in the mill. The other part of it is it's far enough away from the cosmopolitan centers that it's not a trendy place. It's like small-town America used to be.
A continuing challenge to eastern Connecticut's sense of itself is suburbanization and, in some areas, gentrification. Some eastern towns, especially in the Connecticut River Valley and on the shoreline, have evolved into largely upper-middle-class enclaves.
Say Madison, Guilford, are not unlike, say, Old Lyme, Old Saybrook, Essex, Chester. They tend to be almost exclusively high-income areas, you know, very white populations, very well educated. There isn't a lot of diversity.
In the Hartford region, the growth of the suburbs has changed the demographic profile of many eastern communities.
There's a real differentiation between sort of the more blue-collar places like Manchester and East Hartford, which are now really becoming homes for immigrants, and the much more white, basically, suburban fringe towns, which have stayed very homogeneous demographically as they've grown.
We, I think, have some towns that aspire to be, say, like Farmington and Avon and Simsbury, but we do not, I think, have the concentrations of wealth east of the river that are west of the river. The population centers of the state are on the west bank of the river, we're on the east bank. So I think there's still a bit of a class difference. On the other hand, we're not so divided as a matter of social or economic class that we go across the river, we think the people are from Mars or something. 30 years ago, east of the river was very dependent on west of the river, both in an employment and a commercial sense. That's completely different today. I think Manchester is as much a center of an area now as Hartford is. We've gained thousands of people who've moved out of Hartford and come east of the river looking for a better place to live. We've got the Buckland Hills Mall area in Manchester, which is probably the commercial, the retailing center anyway, for almost the northeast quadrant of Connecticut. We've got the University of Connecticut, which is a bigger force in the state than ever. There was a survey, I think, that UConn did 10 years ago that found a huge percentage of the population in this area connected to the university, either by employment or by somebody in the family having gone there or planning to go there. I do think east of the river probably has as great a sense of itself as ever right now.
In the last few decades, economic change in many eastern communities has been accompanied by significant racial and ethnic change.
You know, 20 years ago, Manchester was a really almost exclusively white place. That's been a big shift in the last 10 years because it used to be the cities that were really the main conduits for immigration to Connecticut. Now it's places like suburbs east of the river. You know, Manchester and East Hartford are really, and Vernon to some degree, are really small cities, but those are the places where immigrants are really, and Norwich are really coming into Connecticut.
Our largest minority population in Norwich is Haitians, and that migration began several years ago. So that migration just expanded when the casinos needed workers. And next to that would be the Asian community. Approximately in the last 2 years, we probably have an increase of maybe over 3,000 Asians coming into the community to work at predominantly Mohegan Sun. Many of them still work here during the week and return to their homes in the New York area on weekends. But many of them settled here, and they'll be part of our community for years to come. This has come so quickly in a very short period of time, and at a time when we have a state budget crisis, as well as major problems on the federal level. So this impacts the entire region, and I think the issues, transportation, school cost, housing, is absolutely something that has to be and is being addressed by our Council of Governments and our Economic Development organizations.
Suburbanization has long been a factor in changing eastern Connecticut. Each passing decade continues to bring more suburban-style development to eastern towns.
Glastonbury, Manchester certainly, South Windsor, all of those towns were at one time a lot more like eastern Connecticut in the sense being heavily dependent upon farming, where there was available water power. Manchester, the Cheney Mills, Glastonbury, Cotton Hollow area, they had the sort of textile manufacturing that you see here. But let's face it, they were very close to what once was a very prosperous and powerful city. And the life of that city spread beyond its borders.
The population of Glastonbury, now 32,500, grew by 262% from 1950 through 2000. In recent years, the town has added from 150 to 200 new homes a year. The Rose family has been farming in Glastonbury since 1910.
Back then it was a farm town. There was different villages in Glastonbury, and there was usually a mill around it, and the people there worked. And then they might work there in the winter and do their farming in the summertime. And, there was small farms. There was dairy farms in Glastonbury. Tobacco was big. And then tobacco kind of petered out, although it made a resurgence for a while just recently. All the dairy farms are gone, and there's some fruit and vegetable farms left. Pratt & Whitney made the biggest change in this area. When the aircraft kept growing, they ended up hiring quite a few of these people. Values got up so high that it was worth selling out to development. We're changing all the time as to how we do things. We've been in this pick-your-own probably close to 35 years, I think. And people that are still farming now, they're here because they like to be. So if people really supported local agriculture, I don't think most farmers would leave.
Glastonbury, from my experience, is that town on the east side of the river that is most similar to the towns that you think of immediately on the west side of the river, the West Hartfords, the Avons, the Simsbury, and Farmingtons. You share a lot of the attractions of eastern Connecticut, which is a very rural atmosphere, and we have some very rural areas of this community. Certainly it's an issue for us, how much residential growth can this community handle. It's put a tremendous pressure on our educational system and our infrastructure as a whole. The largest challenge for us has been balancing the tax rate and keeping up with that need for infrastructure. To me, Marlborough, Hebron, Portland are probably a number of years behind Glastonbury in terms of growth and some of the things we're seeing happening in town. But they're a little farther down Route 2, so it's moving in their direction.
The latest numbers suggest that during the 1990s, the state consumed land at a rate about 9 times the rate of population growth. And the places that's being felt are like really probably more than anywhere else in the state is kind of the east of the river metropolitan fringe, towns like Willington, Colchester. I mean, there's houses sprouting in the woods like nobody's business out there, and it's creating a lot of problems in terms of fiscal stress on these towns. It's a real problem because the way local governments are financed in Connecticut, it doesn't really respond well in places that are growing very fast.
The old farming community of Colchester, now an easy commute to Hartford, New London, Norwich, and the casinos, is one of the fastest growing towns in the state. The neighboring town of Lebanon is also starting to feel the effects of growth.
Agriculture is still the largest industry in town. Now we have much larger, highly scientifically managed, technologically advanced farms. 90% of the people in Lebanon commute out of town to business. And in the old days, you would have found that 90% of the people stayed in Lebanon to work on their farms. Lebanon is seeing an enormous increase in development, particularly the last 5 years. It's now over 7,000 people. The problem is that the land that they need to build houses on is the prime agricultural land.
The most recent transforming force in the region has been the development of 2 huge Indian-owned casinos, Mashantucket Pequot's Foxwoods and the Mohegan Sun. They are the most visible elements of the region's emergence as a tourism and entertainment center. Casino profits have enabled the tribes, descendants of the region's first people, to reconstitute growing native communities with governmental and cultural infrastructures. The casinos also have generated about 23,000 jobs, making them the largest employer in the region.
That really saved the region in terms of jobs. Now, granted, they're much lower paying jobs. They're service jobs. They don't involve the same skill levels that were evident in the trades at Electric Boat. But they certainly have created a tourism industry that has been very productive for the region.
70,000 people a day on average visit the casinos, which generate nearly $400 million annually for the state.
Clearly, the Indian casinos are going to change the culture of southeastern Connecticut. Certainly the towns in the immediate area, North Stonington and Ledyard and Preston, are very much aware of the changes that are being brought to their communities. This is going to spread.
Well, I think there's incredible pressure on the communities to try and maintain their quality of life. 15 years ago, we had less than 200 calls a year for our ambulance and fire departments combined. Since the casinos, we have over 1,000 calls a year for volunteer fire departments. The same with police protection. There's tremendous pressure on subdivisions in which add pressure to your school system. Many people in southeastern Connecticut feel that politically in Hartford, they feel that the state of Connecticut ends at the Connecticut River, and they forget about southeastern Connecticut. For example, the city of Bridgeport receives more from the Mohegan Mashantucket-Pequot formula than all 20 towns in southeastern Connecticut combined.
The region's most serious problem remains the revival of its aging small cities.
The primary issue in New London right now is how do we pay for basic services while at the same time remaining the home community to a number of non-profits and not-for-profits. 54% of our land base here in New London is non-taxable. That can be a tremendous burden. It's been a real juggling act.
Its worst problem is it only has about 6.5 square miles. So there's not much land on which to put economic development. There's some at the State Pier, and there's some down in the Fort Trumbull area near a new state park. But apart from that, all it can really do is renovate its downtown. It's the best port in Connecticut. And to have a downtown right on the water with a major transportation hub is incredible. If the public and private planners and developers can work intelligently together, that it could be a very charming town with a large middle-class population, residential population downtown.
Norwich, once the richest city in the state and now one of the poorest, is profiting from its position midway between the two casinos.
This city was a city without a future until the casinos came. We are the housing center for both casinos. The housing impact has some negatives. Rents have risen very rapidly. But when rents rise, then landowners have money to put into renovations. And with the flow of money into our professional offices, lawyers, accountants, into the myriad small firms that do construction, and particularly something like this $19 million investment in downtown Norwich, we now are on the uptick. We have, for the first time, a growing population. Now, the groups that are coming here are of all kinds. Yes, we have people living here who change bed and clean toilets at the casinos, but we also have middle managers who come here and buy lovely Victorian houses at very favorable prices for Connecticut. All this is very important and part of the revitalization of the city.
When the mills left town, Willimantic's economy nosedived after years of prosperity. Local leaders have been striving to revitalize the town, in part by evoking past triumphs and local lore. One legend from the 1700s involves hundreds of bullfrogs, whose noisy mating rituals were mistaken for the war cries of Indians about to attack.
It's very eastern Connecticut to put those giant spools of thread on the two ends of the bridge on either side, and then to put those Volkswagen-sized big frogs on top of the spools. To me, that gives a tribute to history and local legend, but it also is a tribute to this town's self-deprecating sense of humor. Willimantic has lots of problems and lots of issues, but it is more than just those. Drug addiction and poverty and bigotry. Nobody's denying that, but there is also in this community a very, I think, typically Eastern Connecticut sense of community. And also, there are solutions afoot here in this town.
There's, I think, a country western song, a good thing about hitting rock bottom is that you have nowhere to go but up.
Absolutely, that's the way we feel here, and we consider ourselves the gateway to the Northeast. We're the urban center, if you will, for much of the rural area of Eastern Connecticut. And we talk about all of the treasures here, the undiscovered treasures, and we're trying to put those on the map. And we focus on the retail district, and we try to work outwards from there. But it's going to take time, and what will be critical will be how well we market ourselves as a diverse community with a lot of opportunity to take part in various activities, and much of it centered on the student population and becoming a college town, if you will. With Eastern Connecticut State University being home right here in Willimantic, and UConn 7 miles up the road. We are using the history of Willimantic to help us leverage the investment that's taking place here. There's an opportunity here because there's value.
In Willimantic, as in many eastern towns, the nature of the place itself is seen as an economic resource. In 1994, the town of Willimantic acquired the vacant American Thread buildings for a $40 million redevelopment project.
There's been about $33 million spent on the project to date. It really is a long-standing history of innovation, and that's, again, what we're trying to bring back here. We're really trying to work with a lot of startup companies. Out of the 15 tenants we have now, 8 of them are new startup ventures. And a lot of these companies are technology related. I think we'll end up with between 700 and 800 jobs when we're all said and done. If we can revive the mills, we can revive the town.
Many towns in the region are looking to cultural tourism as an opportunity for economic growth. The old mill town of Putnam has gained a wide reputation as a charming town and antique center.
People are genuinely enthusiastic that Putnam has become an antiques center. It's been able to define the area as a destination and not as a washed-up mill town, but rather as a place where people love to come, where there's things to do. And I've been told that some of the businesses that have located here made their decision after visiting Putnam on a Sunday afternoon and seeing how vibrant the commercial district was.
Tourists and vacationers are nothing new for Eastern Connecticut. Along the shoreline in the 19th century, upper crust vacation enclaves prospered, with patrons arriving by rail and steamboat. In the 20th century, scores of farmers farther north, notably in the river-accessible town of East Haddam, took in summer guests, later converting their farms to popular summer resorts. In the south, New London's Ocean Beach and other shoreline destinations have long attracted visitors. Towns like Mystic Village are reminders of the region's significant maritime heritage. The region's history is emerging as one of its most valuable resources. Major attractions like the Mashantucket Pequot Museum, Mystic Aquarium, and Mystic Seaport, along with numerous historic home and other smaller museums, bring the stories of Eastern Connecticut to hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. Traveling its roads, viewing the rural landscape and former mill villages, visitors can still get a vivid sense of the region's rich history.
There's a sense of getting back to history and nature. It gets you away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. It's just beautiful. It's just a matter of time before more and more folks realize that, even though we are far away in spirit, we are really right in the middle of a lot of action. We have the 2 largest casinos in the world less than 40 minutes away.
Deliberate efforts are underway to preserve the sense of place and special character of Eastern Connecticut. The Quinebaug-Shetucket Heritage Corridor was established in 1994 to help preserve the region's cultural, historical, and natural heritage.
70% of our land mass is still forests and farms.
And if you look at a satellite image of the East Coast at night, or if you're flying on a plane up the East Coast in the evening and you look at the pattern of light versus dark, you'll see we're the last big chunk of dark sky country this close to the coast. We find that the kinds of resources that exist here act in concert with one another to attract people who are interested in a small town experience, a family experience, kind of getting back to their roots. One of our more popular ventures, in fact, as a heritage corridor, is a program called Walking Weekends that allow people an opportunity to investigate an old mill or an archaeological site or the bison farm, whatever it might be, with a guide that has some expertise and learn something about the resources and have a good time. The very blessing of having all this open space is also a curse because we have the most land. It's relatively low cost compared to other areas of southern New England. We're within an hour and a half of every major urban area in southern New England. And that's an acceptable commute for people who want to live in this kind of an environment. So I hope that our communities will be able to be proactive, be prepared for increased pressure for development instead of having to be reactive to it.
In the end, it's only fitting that a region so rich in history should turn to its past to renew itself once again.
One of my favorite quotes comes from a Russell Baker book called Growing Up, and he said that we should all realize that our journey is not from the diaper to the shroud, but that we are connected through the umbilical cord to the generations past in ways that we both can understand and ways that we don't understand and can never understand. And I think a town is like that too, and I think an area, a region, is like that. So I think to recreate the past or to try to hold on to something in an unnatural way is not very productive. But to have a sense of the past as you're creating the future, I think is a great idea.
Mashantucket Pequot Museum, where you can walk through a 16th century Pequot village and experience a time when the land was bountiful. But every day could be a challenge for survival.
East of the River is part of the Connecticut Experience series, co-produced by CPTV and the Connecticut Humanities Council. Together, we're exploring Connecticut's rich history and culture. Funding for the show comes from our title sponsor, the Mashantucket Pequot Museum. Additional support is provided by the Community Foundation of Southeastern Connecticut, with special thanks to Lucy Bartlett Crosby and the Chronicle Printing Company. East of the River is a co-production of CPTV, the Connecticut Humanities Council, and Simon Pure Productions.